Hey guys, welcome back for our second video on the New Deal, topic 7.10. And in this video, we're going to pick up by looking at the Works Progress Administration, or WPA for short. And this really ties into something we looked at in the last video about how Franklin Roosevelt believed that to get the economy back on track, the federal government was going to have to spend a lot of money helping people get back to work. In some cases, just paying for people to work for the government. And then with that income, people will be able to, pay their rent. They'll be able to put money in the bank. They'll be able to buy more things, and that increased consumer demand will put people back to work. That was kind of the plan of priming the pump, as they said. So let's look at one of these programs that was attempting to do just that with federal dollars, the WPA. And this is going to be established in 1935. So kind of towards the end of his first administration, his first term. Some $11 billion are going to be spent over the course of 8 years on all kinds of work, okay, whether it's public buildings, building bridges, roads, airports, schools, paying for school lunches. There's just a lot that goes into the WPA, and some 9 million Americans will find a job in the WPA. And you can see a map here kind of showing you all the different things that the WPA was doing. They might be building an administration building at a local college, or maybe they're building recreational buildings at a local school, or maybe they're setting up an athletic field or something like that. So there's a lot of work the WPA was going to do. Now, the WPA did things besides just physical labor. They also hired artists to create art. In particular, probably one of the most famous examples of this would be murals that were done by artists hired by the WPA. Many of these graced federal buildings, post offices, that sort of thing, and a lot of them are still on display today. Some of them, unfortunately, have been destroyed, but that's a different story. Another thing the WPA did is it hired people to go out and interview the last remaining former slaves. So people who would have been basically a child in slavery, and when slavery finished in 1865, at this point they're probably in their late 80s, 90s, some of them even 100 plus. And so it's really our last chance to talk to people who were part of this, who lived that experience, and they can tell us a lot about what that was like. And so we're going to hire people to go out there and do that. We're also going to pay to help adults go back to school. So maybe night school or something like that, to maybe get better job skills and kind of move up. And better job skills, more likely you're going to be able to get a job when the job market is rather tight. Another big organization we're going to look at with the New Deal is the National Recovery Administration, or NRA. Now, this is not the more famous National Rifle Association of modern American politics. It's not that NRA. It's a different one. And the NRA stood for National Recovery Administration. If you recall, there was relief, there was recovery, there was reform. And recovery was that point where we're going to try to stimulate industry once again. We're going to try to get businesses back on track. And the NRA was a very, very complex program. It had all kinds of moving parts and such. And its goal was to create these fair codes of fair competition. And these were not going to be imposed by the government. It's more so that the industries themselves, in cooperation with the government, would develop these codes. Now, what do I mean by codes? Well, it could be things like wages. It could be hours. It could be other labor policies. Just basically the things businesses do to operate. If all the businesses that agree to these programs are following these rules, it was thought that maybe businesses would focus less on competition and more on strengthening, and before you know it, businesses would be doing better. At least, again, that was the plan. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. In some industries, there were these things called ceilings on maximum hours. The theory behind this one is, instead of having, say, one person work 50 hours a week, you would hire two people who each individually work 25 hours. So yes, Obviously, that means not everyone's going to be getting as many hours, but you're going to take those hours and spread them among more people. There was also a push to put minimum wages into place in certain industries. And that was the hope. And businesses that participated in the NRA, they would post their thing here, we do our part. So, we're patriotic, we're following along with the rules and all that stuff. And the Blue Eagle of the NRA became a very popular emblem. As you can see here, this little human collage, if you will, of the NRA. In fact, as a connection to modern day sports, the Philadelphia Eagles, the reason they're called the Eagles is because of the NRA. That symbol was so popular. So the NRA was really a victim of its own ambition. It was trying to be almost like this cure-all for all things in industry, and it just was too complex. There was fraud and businesses pretending like they were following these rules, these different codes of fair competition. They really weren't. And ultimately, the NRA dies because of a Supreme Court case. It's known as the Schechter case, and this involves the Schechter brothers, who were chicken farmers. And this is why you see the Blue Eagle there. There's a chicken, and you can see how the chicken, they've run into the chicken, and the NRA is kind of broken down here. And the justification for ruling the NRA as unconstitutional was that the Constitution gives the federal government the authority to regulate interstate commerce. That means, commerce that crosses state lines. But they were trying to regulate businesses that were intrastate or inside a state. So they were micromanaging these small businesses, and the Supreme Court said, well, no, the NRA has no authority to do that. And so the NRA was shut down. And for FDR, this is really one of his first major political setbacks. And the idea of the Supreme Court kind of standing in his way is something we're going to look at later, because that's going to take a pretty interesting turn here in a little bit. All right, now let's talk about our farmers. What's up with farmers in this time period? Well, honestly, the same thing that's been happening since we've been talking about them basically from the beginning of the semester. Farmers are facing all kinds of problems, right? They're still in debt. Their crop prices are still low. They're still producing too much, which is actually feeding, of course, the low prices. They were in danger of being foreclosed on. Things were just looking pretty awful for a lot of farmers. So the question was, well, if we can raise crop prices, that will take care of a lot of these other problems. So how do we raise crop prices? That was the question. And so this brings us to the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. And you're going to notice here that all these different programs are known by their initials. We had the WPA, the CCC, now the AAA, the NRA, and we'll look at more others. And this is known sometimes informally as FDR's alphabet soup of programs. Anyhow, what the AAA does is its plan was to pay farmers to reduce their crop output. And by reducing their crop output, surpluses would be eliminated. And, it's basic supply and demand. All of a sudden, supply goes down because farmers aren't producing as much of that stuff, and prices would go up. That was the goal. However, therein lies some real problems, right? Because to pay farmers to produce less means you're literally paying farmers not to farm. Okay, and you're also causing crops that are already in the ground to be destroyed so that they won't be counted against a farmer. Okay, to reduce their production. Livestock were slaughtered to meet the quotas. Farmers were spilling untold gallons of milk out just to destroy it because they had to qualify to get the government assistance by reducing their output. So again, we have a time period in which people are going hungry, and at the same time, through sort of indirect incentives, the federal government's encouraging people to destroy food. That's pretty awful to think about. Ultimately, the AAA is going to reach the same conclusion that the NRA did. It's going to be ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And now we have two court cases now, two programs killed off by the Supreme Court. And FDR is an angry man. over these developments, as we're going to find out. All right, now let's get into, I would say, one of the most famous events in the context of the Great Depression. It's something that, if you only know one or two things about the Great Depression, this is probably one of those two things. It's the Dust Bowl. So let's get a little bit of context on what's happening here with the Dust Bowl. So in the 1920s, the Great Plains, particularly the Western Plains, were unusually wet in the sense that they got more rain than normal. And so this really encouraged a lot of people to go out there and farm soil that frankly should never have been plowed up. Okay, they really should never have done this because the climate is so marginal. Like some years you're going to get by, other years you're not. And then in the 1930s, the rains stop, and basically a 10-year drought sets in. The topsoil of the Great Plains, which has been, basically plowed over to make these wheat farms. Most of them were wheat farms, anyways. That soil is exposed to the sun. It's super dry. It turns into a fine powder. And if you've ever been to the Great Plains, guys, there's like this constant wind out on the Great Plains, and it's picking all that dirt up and creating these almost apocalyptic looking sandstorms known as black blizzards. And black blizzards could be, a mile or two high. They might be 100+ miles wide. They would roll into an area and turn daylight into midnight. It really looked like the end of the world. And this is, of course, just picking up millions of tons of topsoil and dumping it far to the east. In fact, some of these black blizzards were so big that they would roll all the way across to the east coast and out into the ocean. And there are reports of some of these really bad black blizzards of people, fishermen and people out at sea, basically being rained on with dust from the plains. You're out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and Kansas is falling on you. I mean, how weird is that, right? And it's just further evidence that the Great Depression was an incredibly tough time, and that, the economy's failing. Mother Nature seems to be turning against us. These people just can't seem to catch a break. And again, 1 or 2 year drought is difficult but doable. A decade-long drought, not so much. And eventually what's going to happen is these black blizzards and severe droughts going to lead to mass exodus, okay? Migration, in other words. So hundreds of thousands of people are going to leave the Dust Bowl. And a lot of them are going to find their way to California. And there are a lot of rumors that there were jobs to be had in California. It turns out a lot of that was not true. And a lot of Californians, frankly, looked down on these arrivals. And since a lot of the people who came from the Dust Bowl were from Oklahoma, collectively, most of the Dust Bowl migrants were known as Okies for short. And that was kind of a slanderous term a lot of people used, here come the Okies, those poor, Okies, we don't want them in our neighborhood kind of thing. John Steinbeck, the famous author, wrote a novel called The Grapes of Wrath, which follows the story of one of these migrant families. And it's one of the more famous novels ever written, and really a classic of the Great Depression. All right, now let's go on to our next big program, the TVA. And for those of us here in Middle Tennessee, the TVA is something we have all heard of. It stands for the Tennessee Valley Authority. And the TVA was a project that really predates the Great Depression. It was something that had been sort of thought about in the 1920s under Hoover. It was this thing called the Muscle Shoals Program. And the plan was to develop the Tennessee Valley by putting dams on the rivers, and this would generate lots of hydroelectricity. It would also help control flooding in an area that was very flood prone. And with this cheap electricity, you would really unlock this region, because the Tennessee Valley, right through here, guys, this was one of the poorest places in America. I mean, it was just dirt poor, really having never fully recovered since the Civil War. And so the TVA certainly looks like a program that would turn everything around. And so it's put into place in 1933, and all of a sudden you've got dams going up on the rivers. Now, this turns out to be very controversial, And one of the major reasons it's controversial is that you are producing electricity, the government is, and selling it to consumers. Now, because the government doesn't need to run a profit on this, they can sell the electricity basically at cost. That means they have an enormous advantage against private companies, because private companies exist because they run a profit. In other words, whatever it costs the private company to generate the electricity, they're going to sell it for more than that, right? That's how businesses work. But the government doesn't have to do that, so they could just come in and offer much cheaper electricity, which means you have private companies at a disadvantage. And a lot of people thought, well, heck, this is, what is this, communism? I mean, this isn't fair. The government shouldn't be involved in planning the economy and picking winners and losers. That is the very opposite of laissez-faire. So again, very controversial program the TVA was. Now, whether or not it was the right thing to do, the reality is the TVA did have a lot of benefits from people. It provided many, many jobs. It does provide cheap electricity for an area that desperately needed it. It's going to also be involved in building homes and settling neighborhoods and kind of creating communities. It's going to control the floods on the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers and a lot of their tributaries. And the TVA also does a lot of reforestation work to try to keep soils from eroding. And I mean, just tons of benefits here from the TVA. And of course, again, if you're from Middle Tennessee like we are, you know this, the TVA is very much still around and very much still producing electricity for the people of this region. All right, guys, I think we're going to call it quits on the second video. And then in our third video, we're going to pick up with Social Security and try to figure out what that program is all about. And then we'll also talk about some of the outcomes of the New Deal, and whether or not it really fixed the Great Depression. So again, that's all to see in their third and final video on the New Deal.